Good morning. My name is Malcolm. I'm from the University of Derby, and the title of my presentation is The Effect of Context and Supernatural Belief on Cognition. So before I actually plough on with the presentation, I'd like to thank the people who've helped me out with this, Professor David Sheffield and Dr. Ian Baker, and I would also like to thank the BL Foundation for funding this research. So the overall aim of this study is to examine implicit belief, whatever that might be, and its effect on explicit belief, cognitive processes on the four groups of a believer that I identified in one of my earlier papers. So just as a reminder, they're down the bottom. So the four different types, I've got skeptics, paranormal believers, this is people who believe in paranormal phenomena exclusively rather than and religious believers only, so people who don't believe in paranormal phenomena but believe in religious beliefs. And a believers group who kind of believe in all of it, so both paranormal and religious phenomena. So why am I looking at this area? Well, this is kind of an extension of my earlier work, and I did do a bit of stuff on implicit association and implicit belief, and I wanted to see how that might actually affect what people think. So effectively, is there some kind of mismatch between what people say they believe, their explicit belief, so what you might measure on a scale, for example, and this kind of implicit belief? So I kind of wanted to get at that, and I thought one of the best ways to do that might be using a priming paradigm. So maybe there's a possibility we could prime people to think in a certain way, to answer questions in a certain way, and that being based on either the beliefs they hold explicitly or implicitly. And I wanted to do this look at using an implicit association test, measure that implicit belief, which is something I'll go into later, and generally get an overall picture of what implicit belief might look like overall. So here's a bit of background research looking at priming a belief. So quite a bit of stuff has been done in this area. So Bloom and Arikan demonstrated that priming can trigger specific types of implicit belief. So this might only activate certain types of these kinds of beliefs. So other studies found that priming doesn't affect non-religious participants reliably, but it depends on what kind of activation is going on. So is there a difference, for example, between religious primes and paranormal primes? Nees and Phillips, they used priming in a paranormal context when looking at EVP and found a clear indication that priming and context affect perception within a paranormal framework. So would this actually, though, affect the way that people think and the way interpret things that are going on around them? So generally, the findings from these studies around supernatural belief, they're generally very mixed, and it could emanate from different levels of implicit associations of belief. So if, say, somebody, for example, more implicitly associated with religious belief, would that make a difference if they just implicitly associated with paranormal belief? And is there even a difference between the two? So I looked for some theory to back this up, and this is something I came across during my PhD, this idea of Alief. So implicit belief may seem like a bit of a misnomer, but this category of Alief, it looks at people's beliefs and compares it to the behavior and finds that there's some kind of mismatch between the two. So there's a discrepancy between what we say we believe, but then again, what we actually do. So Gendel was the person who came up with this, and he used the example, you've probably seen it, there's a glass-bottomed bridge across a canyon, and even though it's perfectly safe to walk across, it's really thick glass, people are still scared to walk across it. So even though their belief is, we know it's safe, but their behavior is they're still scared, or people watching horror films, even though they're clearly in no danger, they still get scared. And also, one of the other examples that was mentioned in one of the last presentations this morning was luck. So people wishing each other good luck, even though they don't necessarily believe it. This was taken a little bit further, and this has actually been mentioned already, which is quite interesting, that Alief is analogous to dual process thinking. So type 1 thinking, being intuitive, automatic, unconscious, and therefore implicit, and type 2 thinking being more reflective, and this being the state of belief. So getting down to actually how I wanted to measure this, studies have been done looking at implicit association. So the top study there showed there's no correlation between implicit paranormal belief and explicit paranormal belief, which if you think about it is kind of interesting. So what people actually say they believe paranormally isn't showing up in the implicit association test, which means there's potentially something interesting going on. So skeptics, however, weren't affected by manipulation in the context of religious belief, but skeptics who were not analytical thinkers, so they weren't type 2 thinkers, could be open to biases towards supernatural belief given the right conditions. So if you're a skeptic and you don't necessarily think analytically, then you can potentially be swayed by these things. But as we'll see later on, this gets a little bit more complicated. Also, I wanted to look at metacognition. A loose definition of metacognition is thinking about thinking. So how we actually monitor our own thought processes. But also I wanted to use this as a measure of confidence as well. So the idea being I wanted to show the awareness of a particular holder of a belief of their perceived limitations. How confident are they, for example, with answers to the cognitive reflection test? So the cognitive reflection test, for those of you who have not come across it, is a measure of kind of like reflective versus intuitive thinking. So it gets to this problem to see if people actually would rather think more analytically or more intuitively. And of course, we've talked quite a bit already this weekend about intuition and things like that, and I think it ties in quite nicely. So one thing that has been done previously with paranormal research using the cognitive reflection test is generally saying that people who believe in certain things may not be thinking analytically. But with an addition of a confidence measure, what's actually going on is people may be giving the wrong answers to these tests, the wrong and inverted answers or the intuitive answers, but they're not actually confident that they're giving the correct answer. So it's not so they're fully aware that they're not doing it, they just possibly bottom out a bit quicker than some other people in the group. I know when I do these things, a lot of these rationality tests, I just bottom out and think, I know I'm not getting this right, but my brain just can't cope with it. So I kind of check out. So I thought that was very interesting. So within the area of the supernatural, research has shown that supernatural beliefs are more likely to be confident in their intuitions, and lower cognitive reflection is more likely to exhibit overconfidence. So this interesting idea that the more intuitive you are actually quite confident. So is this kind of a necessity when believing in the paranormal? So what benefit is looking at metacognition actually going to give us? Well, the measures of metacognition could provide the link between implicit and priming paradigms. So is it going to be that link there between this implicit nature of belief and what's going on with the prime? Is this idea of confidence and you monitoring your own thought process going to do it? So there is actually evidence that belief has an effect on intelligence, reasoning and thinking style, but it could actually be the type, dimension and measure of the belief that's actually having an effect. So a lot of the time, particularly when you're looking at religious belief, is it actually the religious behavior that's having an effect, what you do, or is it this kind of more intrinsic spiritual belief that's having an effect, or what's actually going on under the hood, if you like? So the measuring of metacognition would also show the awareness of a particular holder of a belief of their perceived limitations. So do different types of believer have different views of their own limitations? Okay, so how did I actually get around to doing this? So I had several different measures to look at this. The participant information is on your left if you want to have a read of that. I'm not going to go through it. I used my own belief in the supernatural scale to classify people into different types of believers, because I use that to separate people into skeptics, paranormal believers and religious believers. The cognitive reflection test, I used a long version of that. The original cognitive reflection test has only got 3 items, so it's been criticised a little bit for that, so I used a longer version. And that, as I said, measures the intuitive and normative responses as a measure of effortful reasoning, and I had a confidence measure on that. So they'd I'd ask them the question, this is all online, and then I'd say, I'd add a sliding scale that they could manipulate on the online thing, and they could measure from 1 to 100 their confidence. I used the Brief Implicit Association Test, and I modified that for religious and paranormal stimuli. So effectively, it matches different categories of belief with good and bad words. It's a word-based thing. And the idea is if you press the button faster, then you're more likely to kind of associate those two things together. So, for example, haunting and good. If you're more drawn to paranormal, you press that button faster. But if you didn't like that, you'd be a little bit slower. I used the MCQ30 as a measure of metacognition. The procedure I actually followed, so to prime people, I set the studies up as either being religious, neutral, or paranormal. So the briefs were set out like that, so the participant went in. And then I actually used several different primes before I took the measures to drive it home. So the prime for religion, you can see there, I've used the 10 Commandments. So a lot of studies have used this, but rather than just simply getting people to read it, I wanted to kind of try and embed it a bit more. So on the online survey, you can drag it around and you can move them around. And I asked people to rank them in order of importance. What do you think is most important? They move them around, and when they'd finished, they could press and get it in there. The paranormal, I use items from the revised paranormal belief scale, and this time I asked them to rank in order of believability. So a similar thing. And for the neutral, I got some facts, apparently these are all true, and I asked participants to rank them in order of believability as well. So some interesting ones on there. On average, a hedgehog heart beats 300 times a minute. I don't know, it might do. Okay, the analytic strategy I used, again, just as a reminder on the left-hand side, you've got the categories of believer. I used a cluster analysis on my scale, and that categorized people into different types of believer. And then I did a series of manovers using the measures as DVs, and as IVs, I used the different priming groups. So first of all, I did one on everybody, one on all the participants, and then I did 4 on the different types of believers. So I did a manover for the skeptics, manover for religious believers, so on and so forth, just to get at exactly what was going on within those groups. Okay, so first off, for all of the people, so 172 participants, you can see how the manover is laid out there and all the lovely statistics for you. Save your reading. Non-significant effect of priming group on belief, cognitive reflection, confidence, and metacognition. In this one, I did actually include the subscales of the belief in the supernatural scale, just to see if there's any difference there, and there wasn't anything. So nothing going on overall. So then I went for the skeptics. Again, similar setup, and again, non-significant effect of priming group on belief, cognitive reflection, so on and so forth. So again, nothing going on. Paranormal believers. I had high hopes for the paranormal believers, but again, non-significant. There was nothing going on. You're beginning to see a bit of a pattern here. Religious believers. Again, there was nothing going on there. So these 3 groups, I didn't have a lot of luck with, unfortunately. So there didn't seem to be anything happening. And then I looked to the believers. So if you remember, these people believe in paranormal and religion, and they're quite an interesting group. And the more I look at them, the more kind of nebulous, and the less I kind of understand them. This time, this group were significant. So there was an effect of the priming groups. They seemed to be primed in some way. So I wanted to look a bit more at that. So I did a discriminant functions analysis to try and get at what the different levels are. So this basically built a little profile of the DVs. And it indicated one profile that were low in metacognition, so they weren't monitoring their thoughts. They were reflective, so they were actually thinking about their answers, and they were actually confident with their answers as well. So interesting there. So I call that group positive reflectors. The religious priming group, turns out they were the most likely to exhibit this particular profile, the positive reflectors. So they were most likely to come. So effectively, the believers group were the most likely to be primed and the most likely to exhibit this kind of thing, which I thought was very, very interesting. And
5 minutes.
5 minutes?
Yeah.
Good. I'm I'm reasonably on target there. So it did actually lead me to think quite a bit of it, because initially it kind of was quite counterintuitive. I didn't really know what was going on. So just as a reminder, we looked at all the participants and didn't find anything, and then we analysed the four different groups, and only the believers groups showed a difference, and that post hoc analysis showed us positive reflectors, indicating the profile as I talked about earlier. So the other groups did actually come in a little bit. So the religious priming group were the most likely to exhibit, the believers priming group, there's a bit of a typo there, were the most likely to exhibit the profile. Neutral priming group were the least likely, and the paranormal group did not show a difference in profile association. So it's having some interesting effects that were quite hard to explain, but I did have a go, you'll be pleased to know. What I did realise, and it was suggested to me, this wasn't actually my idea, so I'm not going to take credit for it, the religious prime could actually be more of a moral prime. So the Ten Commandments is shown to be a prime across different types of religious belief anyway, which would be quite surprising. But what if it's actually priming a moral kind of thought process? And it might explain the mixed findings in previous research. Maybe the believer group were more open to outside influence, so they're more easily primed than the other groups, with the religious believers rejecting paranormal belief and the paranormal believers rejecting religious belief for whatever reason that is. But why did the religious prime increase the analytic thinking? Well, one explanation for that is the Ten Commandments is obviously rule-based. And introducing a rule-based way of thinking is known to actually trigger a reflective mindset. So when you're putting these rules in place, giving people rules, it actually makes them think in this kind of way, or encourages them to. Some problems with the study. Bit of a low sample size, particularly when you're splitting off into different types of the analysis. And also, how do we actually know that the priming group was having an effect at all? We did have a control group, so we could compare it, but still there was this idea. And also, we didn't really get to look at what effect the implicit association was having, because it didn't really come up in the profiles. So what were my overall conclusions? Well, generally, I did show that the primes did have an effect on certain types of believer. But the extent to which this influences cognition is in need of a bit of further investigation. I mean, they could have already been of that mindset in the first place, so probably need to look at that in a bit more in depth. This is part one of a two-part study that I'm presenting, so I am aiming to go further. This is quite preliminary stuff. So the primes themselves need more scrutiny to make sure that it's actually a belief that's being primed rather than like a moral thing that we were discussing earlier. But overall, while the nature of implicit belief is still unclear, it does indicate that the type of believer does have a difference on thinking. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bang on time.